Hey there, it's David Leffler. While the Fumes team and I work on a special bonus episode, I want to let you know about another podcast I've been listening to lately that I think you'll enjoy. It's called The Disconnect: Power, Politics, and the Texas Blackout. In February 2021, it got real cold in Texas. So cold that demand for electricity spiked, power plants went down, and the power grid nearly failed. Around 4.2 million households lost power, and over 200 people died. In the first 2 seasons of The Disconnect, host Mose Buchele looked at how the Texas grid works, what caused the blackout, and what was being done, or not done, to fix it. In this episode, the first episode of the 3rd season, Mose and co-host Audrey McGlinchy tell the story of an East Texas con artist who accidentally kickstarted the biggest oil boom in U.S. history. You can find The Disconnect: Power, Politics, and the Texas Blackout wherever you get your podcasts. Or you can click the link in the show notes to take you to the podcast. I hope you enjoy it, and thanks for listening.
Let's go back to how this all started.
So this is the beginning of what might be a historic winter storm here in Austin.
Valentine's Day, 2021. This is me recording the snow falling in my backyard. It's a very unusual thing in Central Texas.
It just started down here. Big question for a lot of people right now is whether the electric grid's going to hold up.
Woo! Of course, we know what happened. Freezing temperatures pushed energy demand to record levels. Our state's power supply, isolated by design from neighboring electric grids, could not meet the challenge. Power plants broke down in the cold. The natural gas that fuels many of them stopped flowing at the very time it was needed most. Across Texas, people went without heat or electricity for days. Hundreds of people, some say many more, died in the cold.
I don't think she would have been in the situation she was had she not been cold. And she was cold because we didn't have power.
In the years since the blackout, what it means to live in Texas has changed. Now, whenever a cold front comes through or a heat wave starts draining our energy supply, we can't help but wonder, is it happening again?
We are keeping a close eye on our power grid this week. ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, which manages the grid, did issue a weather watch. But as you can see,
there's this big debate over how to fix things, how to build and manage a power grid that lets us stop worrying. State leaders say they've made good progress, but in the meantime, the challenges have become more complicated, not less. Over the last couple of years, the state's grid has seen some near misses.
Today will be another close call.
We're looking at ERCOT's supply and demand dashboard.
Some warnings about the future.
The state's power grid operator is predicting that statewide electricity demand will nearly double over the next 6 years.
And some bright spots.
It's a big enough battery to power 130,000 homes for up to an hour.
Through all this, state leaders have returned over and over to one big fix for our statewide grid.
So, we got 200 years worth of natural gas and we need to be using it.
They want to build more natural gas power plants. And in a way, it makes sense. Gas plants use an abundant Texas fuel supply. They're not weather dependent like wind and solar power. They can be turned off and on when needed, at least in theory. It's what they call dispatchable.
We need that dispatchable generation.
Dispatchable?
Dispatchable generation.
You said it better than I can. Dispatchable. Full stop.
But there's also this disconnect between the plan and what happened during the blackout. After all, it was problems at natural gas power plants and pipelines that were largely responsible for the power failure.
We just couldn't get the gas.
It was the high cost of gas that deepened the financial crisis created by the blackout that we're all still paying for.
100 times more than what they normally go for the winter.
And it was the gas industry that seemed to most successfully dodge accountability in the aftermath.
These operators were not the problem the oil and gas industry was the solution.
It sometimes feels like a sane person would look at the last several years of energy anxiety, hurricanes, and heat waves and say, we need to try something new. But in Texas, we looked and said, we need to do what we've been doing, but more.
The bottom line is we have to start building plants.
They want to build more.
There'll be a second wave and a third wave.
And more.
It's never going to stop. It's never going to stop.
We think it's time to take a closer look. In this new season of The Disconnect, we'll look at natural gas production, transportation, and delivery. It's the system that, at least in part, caused the big blackout.
Natural gas failed in a big way.
It's also the system that we're doubling down on to keep the lights on.
We only have to put $10 billion to work. Can we get it done?
What does that mean for climate change?
Climate change is the biggest hoax that we've ever seen in America's life.
How much is politics? How much is protectionism? And how much could be good policy?
You're never going to get credit for a crisis you prevent.
We're going to tackle these questions like we did in earlier seasons, starting with the deep history. We'll tell the story of fossil fuels in Texas to see what it can tell us about where we are today.
These private companies are set up to have monopoly control over the Texas power supply.
And even when this history seems far removed from today, I promise you it's not. And at the very least, it makes for a wild ride.
Somebody hits somebody and they hit the ground.
These are not people that you're used to seeing be very afraid.
And I shouldn't laugh, but he was a scammer, and I don't have much sympathy for that.
It's a story that starts not with natural gas, but with that most Texas of energy sources, oil. I'm Mose Buchele. Welcome back to The Disconnect, power, politics, and the Texas blackout. So, like I said, these first few episodes especially are going to be history episodes. And joining me to help tell these stories is a voice that you know and love, not just from earlier seasons of this podcast. No, I'm talking about from her own excellent reporting. I'm talking about from the podcast Growth Machine. I am talking about Audrey McGlinchy. Audrey, welcome back.
Hey, Mose. Very excited to be here.
I can't believe we're getting the band back together.
Pew, pew, pew.
So like I said, we're going to start off talking about the early days of oil and gas and regulation in Texas. And it's some fun stuff.
These stories are wild, Mose, and I'm so excited to tell them.
Yeah, we're talking bar fights.
Gunfights.
Texas Rangers.
A guy named Lone Wolf Gonzalez.
Yes, and it starts, maybe appropriately, with a great oil field con out of East Texas.
It would change everything.
So to learn about this, we're also going to hear from a guy who knows a ton about all of this stuff.
My name is Paige Foshee. 40 years of my life were devoted to being an oil and gas landman.
A landman is someone who works for an oil company, and they go to landowners and try to get them to lease their land so that they can drill for oil.
But Paige is also a historian and a writer. And his family is, in fact, his family on his dad's side is from the very part of East Texas that we're going to be talking about.
My father took me to see his side of my family when I was 11 in 1965, and I spent 2 weeks with my grandmother. I'd never seen pine trees before, nor oil derricks 80 and 100 feet tall, and I thought about the oil business and compared it in my mind to gold strikes and rushes. I found it, and still do, I find it romantic.
And it is. It's a history full of gamblers, underdogs, and conmen, like the one we're going to be talking about in particular.
Columbus Marion Joyner.
But for reasons you'll soon understand, he came to be known as Daddy or Dad Joyner.
And Dad had been working the East Texas field for 20 years.
Joyner's official job was a lot like Paige's. He would go out, convince landowners to lease their properties so they could drill oil. And in exchange, everyone would usually get a cut of future profits.
Right, and this is where the con comes in. See, after he got the lease, Joyner would get a bunch of investors together to raise money to drill. And this is a pretty normal way of financing a kind of independent oil project. The thing is, in the case of Dad Joyner, he appeared to have no intention of actually finding oil.
Absolutely. If you found oil, you blew it.
See, as long as he did not find oil, he never had to pay anyone back. He could just keep gathering up new investors, and taking all their money.
He would drill and drill and drill, and he would sell parts of oil well projects. Hey, I'll sell you 25% of my well for, $5,000.
Yeah, he could sell the same project to different people multiple times over.
He really made a ton of cash by overselling every well he drilled. That's where his income came from.
As long as he failed, he never had to pay anyone because they had invested in the hope of future profits that would come when Dad Joyner struck oil, which he was never going to do.
Like these days you might get, I'll pay you in stock options on this startup or whatever, but it's like, it's almost the same thing, right?
Oh, certainly. It's not a new story. It's probably one of the oldest.
And when it came to targets, like marks for this particular con, Joyner allegedly specialized in doctors and widows.
Yeah, he was especially kind to widows and maiden women. The older and with more property, the better.
He bragged about knowing a special place on a widow's neck. If he touched it, she would write him a check.
Oh, he was a master of amore.
So in 1927, Joyner was drilling for oil on the property of a widowed woman in Rusk County in East Texas. Her name was Daisy Bradford.
Joyner had gotten the lease from Bradford, and he'd pulled together a lot of investors to fund this drilling.
So it's 1927, and he drills his first well. It's called the Daisy Bradford number 1. Well, at the time, I don't think it was called the number 1, but they call it the Daisy Bradford number 1 because he drilled it and there was no oil, right? This is what they call a dry hole. But for Dad Joyner, that was no problem, right? It was an opportunity to go out and get more investors.
So a couple years go by, it's 1929, Joyner drills another well, the Daisy Bradford number 2. And what do you know? Also dry.
I think the trouble with the Daisy Bradford number 1 and 2 wells was they didn't drill deep enough.
So Joyner got more money together, wrote more IOUs, and started drilling on a third well. And this third oil well, it started to show promise. Signs of oil and gas coming up with the mud and water below.
At this point, the local people around Joyner couldn't help but notice that he seemed uneasy with this. He actually brought in one of his longtime partners to take over operations, a guy named Doc Lloyd.
Practice as a doctor, without the formality of a license.
And again, it seemed to Daisy Bradford and others that Joyner and Lloyd were maybe trying to screw this up.
They were looking for dry holes.
So at this point, Bradford and the other workers on the site wrestled control of the operation from Joyner. Basically, Daisy Bradford used her position as landowner to have him sidelined. And that's probably why the Daisy Bradford number 3 struck oil in October 1930.
It came in big.
So there's a book about all this called The Last Boom, which I highly recommend if you can get your hands on it. And in it, there is a description of the moment that Dad Joyner realized that Daisy Bradford 3 was a winner. And it says he did not dance a jig. No. He did not shout for joy. They say he just kind of briefly closed his eyes and leaned against a nearby tree. His expression kind of blank.
He could not have been happy. He'd oversold that well just like all the rest of them.
Joyner knew he was in trouble. What he could not have known was that the Daisy Bradford number 3, that third oil well, had uncovered the biggest oil field in U.S. history.
So this is how he got his nickname, right? Columbus Marion Joyner was renamed the father of the field, hailed by East Texas as Dad or Daddy Joyner in the newspapers.
Which means his investors came knocking.
It's just terrifically fortuitous for everybody except Dad Joyner, who died broke in the late 40s. And I shouldn't laugh, but he was a scammer, and I don't have much sympathy for that.
It's hard to overstate what Dad Joyner discovered when this oil well came in. It was an ocean of oil that all of these people had been sitting on top of unknowingly, ever since they had settled the land and started farming there. The sheer magnitude of the amount of oil that was found in East Texas would end up literally, like we said, changing world history.
And a lot of that change has to do with how the state of Texas reacted to this discovery.
So here's where we're going to talk about the state agency that regulated oil, and it still does. And it's called the Railroad Commission of Texas.
And you would not be wrong to hear that and think, what the hell do railroads have to do with any of this?
Well, to answer that, we're going to hear from two guys. First,
I'm Professor David Prindle of the University of Texas, Austin Government Department.
Prindle's retired now, but he literally wrote a book about the Railroad Commission.
And then we have somebody who lived it.
My name's Ken Hance, and I have a varied background.
Well, he's a longtime Texas politician. He started as a state senator back in the 1970s.
And then ran for Congress and had a opposition by the name of George W. Bush.
He's actually the only guy that ever beat W. Bush in an election.
I don't know whatever happened to him.
Later in his career, Hance ended up serving as a Texas railroad commissioner from 1987 to 91.
So the first thing we have to talk about is what is the deal with this name, the Railroad Commission?
Railroads dominated the late 19th century economy very much as the automobile dominated it through much of the 20th century, and the computers dominate it now.
So take Texas. Late 1800s, Texas was an agricultural state. Farmers and ranchers grew crops, they raised livestock, and those things were not worth much if you couldn't sell them.
If your town didn't get on the railroad line, your town died.
For a while, the state did anything to attract railroad companies to come to Texas. They gave away land, offered tax breaks, you name it.
And on the one hand, this was great for rural Texans. Suddenly, farmers and ranchers could get their goods quickly to places all around the country.
But it also gave these railroads almost absolute power.
It was a different world.
If there was just one rail line connecting to your town, well, it had monopoly power, right? You paid what that line wanted for shipping. There was price fixing, there's collusion between railroad companies, corruption, and it all led to a lot of pissed off farmers. For a lot of people in rural Texas, these were just Yankee monopolies coming in to steal their wealth.
Now remember, Texas was a rural state. The farmers had political clout. And so in 1891, Governor Jim Hogg established the Railroad Commission. At first, it was made up of 3 commissioners who were appointed.
But these farmers, they wanted the commission to be elected statewide.
This will come up again later.
They thought if they were elected statewide, they could control the commission better that way.
So that's what they got.
But by the time the Railroad Commission really got around to regulating railroads, there was a problem. The federal government had already basically taken that authority. It was the federal government that was going to regulate railroads that crossed state lines, which was most of them.
And that left the Railroad Commission without much to do.
Which brings us back to oil.
It was like a gold rush. It was black gold.
Kent Hance says all these discoveries in the early 1900s showed that there was a lot of oil in Texas, and it was really easy to get at.
Remember this, the old story, the Beverly Hillbillies TV program. They'd shoot into the ground and the oil came up. It just showed that there was so much pressure that the oil would bubble up. Instead of pumping, it flowed.
So getting oil from the ground was relatively simple. Getting it to somewhere you could sell it was not. You could put it in a truck, you could put it maybe on a train, but the most effective way to move oil around is to build pipelines.
But pipelines are a big hassle. They need a lot of upfront investment, they need rights to private property, and they bring the threat of monopoly.
One way of thinking about the history of the industry is to assume that power accrues to transportation.
Or like Ken Hance said,
if your town didn't get on the railroad line, your town died.
What they're saying is no matter what you're making, whether it's oil or whether you're growing crops, you have to have a way to move it. And the people who do the moving are usually the ones with the power. Imagine you have an oil well, but you're kind of like a small timer like Daisy Bradford on her farm, and only one pipeline is connected to your oil field. You're totally at the mercy of that pipeline company. Back in these early days of drilling, that company had a name.
It was John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, a huge company that had a hand in every pot, pipelines, railroads. It was so powerful that people called it the octopus.
It had been Standard Oil's monopoly of pipelines that allowed it to become a monopoly in everything. It wasn't that John D. Rockefeller owned every oil well in Ohio and Indiana and Pennsylvania. It was that he owned the pipelines. So if you produced oil, you had to have your oil transported on his terms. And his terms were he bought you out.
And if he didn't buy you out, you were stuck trucking your own oil to market.
Which meant it was expensive, which means he could undersell you. That was the basis for his monopoly.
As soon as Texas became a big oil-producing state, Standard Oil, the octopus, under a subsidiary called Humble Oil, showed up. And smaller Texas oil drillers, not surprisingly, did not like that.
Now, these smaller drillers,
A lot of times they're called independents.
they used their political clout to get Standard Oil banned from Texas.
It was good for the independents in the sense that they were not dominated by this huge monopoly.
But it was bad for them because they wanted pipelines to move oil. It's the same fight over and over. The trains are useful to move your product, but you're worried about the power of the trains. Same goes with the pipelines.
So in 1917, the Standard Oil Trust and the Texas Independents made a behind-the-scenes deal, which resulted in a law that essentially repealed the ban on Standard Oil, but the Railroad Commission would regulate pipelines.
Why not? Railroads carried people and goods, pipelines carried oil. Why not regulate them the same way? Why not give the Railroad Commission power over the pipeline companies?
In other words, it made Standard Oil be fair in regard to the little guys, because everybody knew what Standard Oil had done to the little guys up in Ohio and Pennsylvania. It had essentially made them extinct.
And that's how the Railroad Commission became the go-to authority when Dad Joyner struck oil in East Texas in 1930.
More coming up after the break. So when we left off, we were talking about this massive oil rush that was happening in Texas in the early 1900s.
And this state agency, the Railroad Commission, which was put in charge of overseeing it.
There were all sorts of conflicts and tensions already bubbling up. Yankee money, angry farmers, big oil. And it all came to a head when the Daisy Bradford No. 3 oil well erupted in a gusher of oil in 1930.
Really, we had what they called oil fever here.
At Stephen F. Austin University, there's an excellent archive of oral history interviews that focus on life in East Texas. The one you're hearing now is from a woman named Helen Griffin. In the 1930s, she was a little kid living in Kilgore, Texas, one of the closest small towns to the Bradford well.
Oil went out the top, and men got oil in their hats, and that's where oil fever began.
Helen talks about how this poor rural community was transformed overnight. Farmers who had been scraping by, if they were lucky, were now sitting on fortunes of crude oil.
Thousands of newcomers, called boomers by the locals, rushed to East Texas to get in on the action.
Those people had come here from Arkansas, Louisiana, all points, to get work because they didn't have work.
The Great Depression had started not quite a year before that discovery.
Here's Paige Foshee again.
So you had desperate farm families with a mortgage they couldn't even imagine paying off ever. Suddenly hear about manna from heaven on the Bradford farm.
I'm going out on that oil field. Tell me it's a payday over there.
Kilgore, where Helen and her family were living, went from an unincorporated town of about 500 people to a city of 10,000 in a matter of months. And along with that came the typical problems of a boomtown.
We're talking drinking, we're talking gambling, we're talking prostitution. What a lot of those town folks thought of as very unsavory behavior.
I mean, it was a holy mess.
One thing that comes up more than once in these oral histories is how women could not leave clothes out to dry during these early days of the boom.
My son was born in May.
And that voice is not Helen Griffin. It belonged to a woman named Gladys Foshee.
Oh, goddamn, she's my great aunt.
And I hung his
So the tape's a little muddy, but she says her son was born in May, and she'd hang his diapers out in the clothesline, and she lost 2 clotheslines full.
Because people needed those things.
So by March 1931, the Texas Rangers come to try to establish order.
And there's one ranger in particular that people still talk about a lot, maybe because he had like the coolest name ever.
Now, you want to know a little something about Lone Wolf Gonzalez?
That's right. Lone Wolf Gonzalez.
Helen remembers how Lone Wolf rounded up hundreds of suspected criminals and paraded them in chains through the streets. Problem was, at the end of that parade, there was no jail to take them to.
They had to put a line in one of the Baptist churches and hook the prisoners to the line like a trot line. And they called them trot line churches because they had the prisoners in the church.
Yeah, if you don't know, trot lines are a kind of fishing line where you put a lot of hooks and bait on one line. So these guys were all connected to each other on this one line. It's kind of like basically a chain gang, right? So it just goes to show for Lone Wolf and his rangers, due process did not really seem to be part of the equation.
But Helen says his approach did cut back on some of the most visible crime.
I'm telling you that they respected Lone Wolf Gonzalez. Nobody got in his way.
But there was at least one crime in the oil fields of East Texas that Lone Wolf wasn't able or willing to get a handle on. And it had to do with something they called hot oil.
Yeah, another cool name.
Hot oil was illegal contraband oil. To understand how this came about, you have to remember that this oil boom means people started drilling everywhere. Front yards, backyards, cow pastures.
Church members tore down their sanctuaries to put in an oil well. Oil men tore out the floor of the Kilgore National Bank to put in an oil well.
People said you could walk from well to well, and you could walk down a row of 10 wells without hitting the ground. You're always on the rig floor.
And the thing is, this huge boom of oil drilling was possible because the discovery of the East Texas field had caught the big oil companies by surprise. That's the reason Dad Joyner chose to drill there. He didn't think there was oil there.
Instead of having a cabal of big oil companies develop an East Texas field, you had farmers doing it. You had anybody who wanted work and needed money.
It was loud. It was chaotic.
And it was suicidal for the oil industry. There are 2 reasons for this. One is geological. If you remember, Kent Hance talked about the pressure that existed underground to push oil upwards. The thing is, when everybody starts getting oil from the same oil field all at once, it lets all that pressure out. It makes it so there's no force left underground to push the oil up.
The oil stays there. You can't get it, and it's wasted. It's gone. You'll never get it.
The other reason all this drilling was a problem was financial. The boom in East Texas was flooding the market with oil. People hardly had anywhere to even keep it. They were sometimes letting it flow into creeks and ditches, keeping it where they could and selling it for pennies.
Yeah, one Texas oil man said, I could sell a barrel of oil at 10 cents and a bowl of chili cost me 15.
But they still kept drilling because for a small town farmer, they'd rather make pennies than nothing at all.
But for a big oil company, this overproduction was a huge problem.
They needed a stable and higher price of oil to cover their larger investments in the business. And they were in this business for the long run, not to make a quick buck.
Yeah, the big oil companies basically thought that these small timers were ransacking, just doing a smash and grab on the oil in East Texas. So they went to state lawmakers and started getting rules passed to set limits on how much oil someone could pump.
The idea was that lowering production would stabilize prices.
These production limits were called proration, kind of a weird term that we're going to be using in the future. And of course, proration was enforced by the Railroad Commission.
And the small-time operators hated these rules.
The farmers, who were desperate, said no. Our notion is that the big companies just want to put us out of business. They can afford to, put their wells at rest for 30 days, and we can't.
Under the system, crude produced beyond the limit was declared contraband.
This was hot oil, and almost everybody in East Texas was doing it.
We still had to run some of the so-called hot oil to protect ourselves.
She was something else.
Here's Paige's great aunt, Gladys Foshee again.
Gladys perfectly describes why this overproduction could not stop.
Because it's not like a tract of timber or something you can save. If you don't get your oil when it's going out, the other fellows got it.
That's right.
So we were guilty, like a lot of everybody else. It was a matter of self-preservation.
Small independent operators kept drilling. The big oil companies kept howling for limits, and the price of oil kept plummeting.
That's just unsustainable. And it wasn't just Texas that was hurting. It was every oil-producing region.
Something had to give, and it did in August of 1931.
That's when Governor Ross Sterling announced the East Texas oil field to be in a state of insurrection and declared martial law.
Sterling sent 2 Ranger captains and about 1,100 National Guard to East Texas to turn off the pumps, turn off the oil rigs, shut everything down.
Next time, the East Texas Oil War. How the fight between a bunch of oil drilling farmers and the heavy hand of the Texas government came to change the world of energy forever. This episode was reported by me and produced by Audrey McGlinchy, Matt Largey, and myself. We had technical help from Rene Chavez and Jake Perlman.
Going to Orwell, Texas. Going to Orwell, Texas.
Special thanks to the digital archives of the East Texas Research Center at Stephen F. Austin University for archival tape.
Going to Orwell, Texas. Going to Orwell, Texas. Cross the river from Hello, Arkansas.
We are supported by you, our listeners. If you want to give us a few bucks to help us keep doing this work, go to supportthispodcast.org. The Disconnect is a production of KUT and KUTX Studios in Austin. I'm Mose Buchele. Thanks for listening.
Going to Orwell, Texas. Cross the river from Hello, Arkansas. Broken Bow, Oklahoma. Roll on. Chitlin Switch, Georgia. Shut up, Mississippi. Break in Louisiana. Scram, Alabama. Going to Orwell, Texas. Cross the river from Hello.